Hello and welcome to Kindred OT TV. Today I have Dr. Julia Wilbarger with me, founder or co-creator of the Sensory Defensiveness course in the TheraPressure protocol with her mum, Patricia Wilbarger. Julia is also a author, an associate professor, avid researcher in the field of sensory integration, has worked extensively in pediatrics as an occupational therapist and is coming out to Australia in less than 4 weeks to share this knowledge with our Australian OTs. So welcome to Julia Wilbarger. Thanks for coming on today.
Thank you for having me. This is a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And before we get started, I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of where I'm coming to you from today, the Yakel people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any First Nations people who happen to tune into our conversation today. Fantastic. So I did hear Dave Jerem say, Julia, that he bugged you and bugged you and bugged you to come back to Australia. And finally, you're here. I just wanted to start by saying how awesome that is and how exciting that is for our Australian OT community. I was just sharing with you how all that nearly 2 decades ago that, I had that experience of attending your workshop with your mum and just how powerful that was for me personally and professionally to understand the nervous system in that way. So thanks for coming back out and continuing this education with our Aussie OTs.
Yeah, well, it's my pleasure. I really love Australia, and Australian OTs are always really well trained and really professional. So it's a great place to come and teach.
Yeah, and Dave's doing some really cool stuff. So I think it's a great match, a great combination to be sharing via his platform as well. So firstly, I always ask my guests this because I'm just so curious. I'd love to hear about your OT journey. And I guess I feel like I would just assume you got into OT because your mum was an OT, but I'd love to hear how you got into OT and just your journey and the path you've taken with that.
Well, I had no intention of becoming an OT. I was really on my way to, I was getting a degree from University of California, Berkeley in physiological psychology. And I was looking at PhD programs to go on and get a PhD in some sort of neuro-based psychology. And my mother, Patricia Wilbarger, got this brainstorm but bee in her bonnet to run this camp for kids. And I had, as a child, as a young person, and as a teenager, I had really benefited from a lot of outdoor experiences, and particularly backpacking with a teacher mentor of mine and other students. And so I really saw the value in it. And she said, well, could you just, help me set up this camp, which, anybody who knows Pat Wilbarger means, can you just make this happen for me? And so she promised to pay me. She never did. But in the course of doing this intensive camp, which became Avanti, which is the model for Jabiru, the Jabiru camp in Australia, I really saw seriously the power of OT. And when the OTs were sitting around and they were talking about children, they were also talking about the brain. And I just had no idea that occupational therapists thought about brain behavior relationships and the complexity they did. And so I couldn't really decide on where I wanted to go for my PhD. And I thought, well, a couple of years of work experiences in OT wouldn't be bad. I'll do that. And so then went and got a master's degree in OT and then practiced for quite a number of years. And then I eventually did go back and get my PhD in developmental cognitive neuroscience. So I did kind of finish up what I intended to do, get those more research skills, get more neuro under my belt. However, the part of that training, people who were my cohort, a good number of them went on to become neuropsychologists. And I was looking at them, I'm like, no, I don't really want another clinical career. The current clinical career I have is just good. And so in the end, it was like, yeah, I really did choose OT and stayed with it. So
Mm. And here was me just assuming you became an OT because your mum's an OT, and it just seemed logical. But that's such a journey. And I guess, why sensory defensiveness? Like, you've had an extensive career. I can see why you would have started out there, but why have you stuck with researching and teaching and continuously getting to understand, as the research evolves and our world evolves, the topic of sensory defensiveness? Why stay there with that? What's so important about it to you?
well, again, it's another one of those where my mother roped me into helping her. When she first started developing the course on sensory defensiveness, it was really based on a series of, clinical experiences using, in particular intensive models of intervention. And the Avanti camp was really one of the first ones. But then she had a couple of other cases, particularly a child, Dustin, who made some very, very remarkable progress within only a few days, when he went from being really an infant who was really completely non-functional to being back on a near normal developmental pathway. And I was in OT graduate school at the time, and she basically asked if I could do some background research, literature research for her. And so again, I started looking into it. And when I really started thinking about, like, really the complexities of sensory defensiveness, it really did fascinate me. And quite ironically, going through some papers at my mother's house, I found a ninth grade paper I wrote in high school on tactile defensiveness. So apparently I was interested in the topic predating, even when I thought I would be interested. But then when I got into my PhD program, what I was really interested in is really emotional responding and affective responding, and particularly thinking about valence priming as an issue with individuals with autism. And I remember at the time I heard a psychology presenter at a really, really big conference say children with autism are blind to the emotions and feelings of others. And I'm like, no. In fact, they are hypersensitive to the emotions and feelings of others, to the point where I think that they try really hard to shut them out and avoid them. But there was no evidence of that. So then I went on to look at do my PhD around looking at affective responsiveness in individuals with autism. And then I really started to see the real distinct tie-in back to sensory defensiveness and sensory processing. And so again, it brought me right back to sensory defensiveness and trying to integrate that work a little bit more. And then the research that I've done since then has been really trying to look at what are some of the underlying mechanisms of sensory defensiveness, because it's not just a tactile problem. It's not just a sensory processing problem. The issues go really deep into the parts of our nervous system that give us signals of safety and danger. And so it really, it hits to a lot of core of how we function as human beings and our ability to participate in life. And I think, like what you said to me, of like when I said, why not free up your child, or why not let somebody be free by, and that's really the essence of it, is that when you treat sensory defensiveness, you allow individuals to be free to explore so many aspects of the environment. So clinically, it feels really meaningful to me. And then as a brain behavior challenge of trying to sort out what sensory defensiveness is, it's always intriguing. There's always, I'm nowhere near an answer. And I'm resigned, because I probably will not have a complete answer before I retire to wherever I retire, whatever I do. But
To Australia, to share over here. That's where you'll retire to.
Well, was recently in Western Australia, and that looks like a pretty nice place to retire, but we'll see.
Well, look, the North Coast of New South Wales is really nice too. You could always retire here. where I am. A couple of things really stood out then. This theory and this neuroscience is so complex. Sensory defensiveness is so complex. So just hearing you speak about just how complex it is I think, is a really important piece to share with the community. And two, about freeing up the nervous system. Like, I think it is complex and the neuroscience is so impressive, but the power is so practical and functional. The outcomes of the brushing and of not just the brushing, but understanding the actual theory and the why. And I really enjoyed what you said about that. So I did want you to maybe, even as quickly, because we've dived straight in, but just if you were on an airplane, or I'm sure you have been in this situation, someone says, oh, so what's sensory defensiveness? How would you define that to somebody on the airplane?
Well, I always start with saying that, like, all of us have our brains, everybody's brain has the ability to sense danger. And for most people, that's calibrated exactly correctly. When something is dangerous, we get alert to it. Our body, we feel our bodies get nervous. Our blood pressure might go up, our heart rate might go up. We might be a little bit more alert to our surroundings. We may feel a little agitated or irritated. But once we're safe, we recover really nicely and go, oh, that was nothing. It wasn't really anything. It wasn't like a tiger in the woods getting ready to jump out at me. It was just a noise or something in the environment. But some people live in that heightened state of defense. And we have there's a lot of emphasis anymore about really understanding people who've had really adverse events, even traumatic kinds of events that have really dialed up the nervous system in order to be way more danger sensitive. So we have a lot of examples of how that happens because of experience, but we also know that there are some children who just are sort of born with a defensive system, kind of defense monitor just kind of dialed up. And so they're really sensitive to signals in the environment that might, indicate danger. So like sometimes, like, the tags in the back of your clothes might feel like a spider crawling on your back. And you can't just ignore, like, if a spider is crawling on your back, you just can't ignore it. It does not go away. You do not habituate. Your brain does not just ignore that. And so that's the same thing with somebody with sensory defensiveness. That tag just stays and bothers them and bothers them and bothers them until they really have to do something. And that it's not only just sense of touch, it could be certain sounds, it could be certain smells, it could be the way our body gets moved or jostled in the environment. So, and that is really dialed up in terms of when we think of somebody having sensory defensiveness.
And it's so fascinating because I really want to ask you this following your conversation with Dave is I'm hearing so much sensory-based content in what you just said. It's called sensory defensiveness, and yet you did just say in your interview with Dave that you see sensory defensiveness more as an affective disorder than a sensory disorder. Can you share a little bit on what you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, in this case with sensory defensiveness, sensation's the trigger. It's not like past experience. So when somebody has trauma, it might be that past experience that puts them into that heightened state of defense and anxiety. It was sensory defensiveness, it's the trigger, but the same parts of our brain, the same mechanisms of our brain that make us fearful or defensive to natural stimuli or adverse effects are the same brain systems that are likely involved in sensory defensiveness. So it's not necessarily a problem with processing sensation at the somatosensory cortex or the visual cortex or the auditory cortex. There's probably brainstem issues involved with it, but we mostly think of it as being a disorder of the limbic system. And when we think of the limbic system is a large function of the limbic system is to give us an idea about the valence of the stimulus that's in the environment. Is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? Is it going to promote my well-being or is it potential for harm? And so it really is that system that, and it is way more linked to things like anxiety or fear-based disorders related to life experience or adverse events than it is of, like, say, a discriminative sensory processing disorder.
And that was actually leading to my next question about that. And you'd also said, and about when we're in a defensive state or a sensory defensive state, we have very limited access to our discriminative system. I loved what you said, and I was thinking about then about the functional and the developmental implications of that, because even, being able to write or tie your laces and all these things that therapists would see functionally. Could you, I guess, draw a connection or expand on that? And maybe I'm totally off base, but I was just curious about, the developmental and the functional implications of this decreased access to our discriminative system, particularly early on.
Yeah, the research and the support for this has been in the brain literature for decades upon decades, of this idea that when you are in this, like what we call low route or more limbic state, that it really does a takeover of the nervous system, and the focus of everything in your behavioral responses is to get to safety. And so the subtler appreciations of the details in the environment, some of the more higher level judgments become really irrelevant to the nervous system. It's not that you can't always know they're there or access them, they just access them. It's just not particularly relevant. And so it's sort of like, and more currently, I think Tracy Stackhouse uses the example of Dan Siegel's work of, like, really kind of blowing the lid off of the cortex, and that the lid is blown off, and it's just, cortical is floating somewhere above where you're at in terms of the current action. But that's been something that's, there's some complicated neuroendocrine systems that dictate that. So there's some different types of norepinephrine pathways that get activated when you're in good attention versus then when you are in emergency. And so then access to your cortex gets limited more to survival mode. So the limbic system pulls in parts of the cortex that allows you to do more survival, more oriented problem solving, and kind of shoves aside the more esoteric. But it's all like there's neurotransmitters that shift dramatically that cause these shifts in access to certain areas of your brain.
It's just so interesting. And I think that's why I want to highlight that. Like, I think we can simplify this content and, like I said before, call it the brushing, or we're doing this, or they've just got that. But it's just so complex how all of those structures work together. And in my experience, it really does deeply impact function across the board, social, play, and, fine motor skills, motor. It just really does have, and you see the reverse when you start to treat these symptoms, via your protocol and a sensory diet, which we'll go into, just how quickly some of these developmental skills come on when the nervous system is supported in that way. So on that note, can you just share, I guess, what a sensory diet is? We see this term thrown around all the time, and I guess we just see it pop up Instagram, Facebook, workshops. And my understanding is Patricia had coined this idea. I've always said that and believed that, so correct me if I'm wrong. But I'd just love to hear your perspective on what a sensory diet is, and in order to be effective and have the integrity of what it was designed to be, what are some of those key features, or what you would want to see in order to call it an effective sensory diet?
Well, Patricia did coin the term sensory diet, and she coined the term when she was doing follow-up programs for families who had infants that had graduated from the neonatal intensive care unit. And what she found is that the families were just very careful with their children, and they tend to not give them a lot of rich sensory experiences that other children who were just born term and, a day in the hospital and home, just hanging them on their hip or, moving them around. And so it was her way of explaining that they needed to have a certain amount of sensation in their life to promote normal development, and then enhanced sensory experiences to counteract any effects of being born early or, other kinds of things that would be in place. And then that sensory diet concept, again, was one of the things that she brought into the original Camp Avanti, which is idea of designing intensive intervention plans using really scheduled sensory motor experiences throughout the day to help somebody stay at an optimal level of functioning, whether it be motor functioning or modulation, regulation functioning. So original sensory diets were quite agnostic to the sensory processing issues. It wasn't specifically designed for sensory defensiveness. But like rolling back to the last conversation, that like the neurobiology of sensory defensiveness is such that that nervous system is in this state of alarm, and using a consistent sensory approach across a day can help kind of keep that sense of defensiveness down. It can kind of get that nervous system out of defense and more into approach wellness. And so then when we think about a sensory diet for sensory defensiveness, we think about timing and thinking about the kinds of sensation that are going to help the nervous system stay out of the danger zone. What's going to bring somebody down from that danger zone? Deep pressure touch, proprioception, slow vestibular, good respiration with nice postural support to it, some kinds of soundscapes, are all those things that are specifically going to help the nervous system in that situation. So a sensory diet is really a carefully planned sensory schedule, a schedule of sensory-based activities that are designed at certain junctures of the day. And it's not like just a list of activities. If you Google sensory diet now, today, you're going to get I think the last thing we looked at was something like 50 million hits or something like that. I mean, some insane, I wouldn't say 5, but I think it went way beyond my imagination. And when you go and you look at those sites, I have a group of OT students at Dominican University where I work in California who are doing a capstone on sensory diet, doing a scoping review. And they each decided that they were going to go and look at about 20 or so just random websites on sensory diets. And I've done this before, but they were all gung-ho to do this. And you go on, and 90% of the time, what's in there is just a list of activities. There's no structure. There's no discussion of collaborating with families to set up a very practical program that can be done easily by the family without being too disruptive for their day. And then using the clinical reasoning to make sure that it really works for that individual child and that individual family. So that sensory people, you can hand a list of 60 wonderful sensory-based activities to a family, and I can guarantee you unless they are some Uber-driven family, they're not going to do any of them. Or it's going to last a day. They'll do a handful and it'll be a day. So yeah.
And I just love what you said then about this being individualized, because when you have a list of activities and you talk about deep pressure, and some of the ideas might be thrown about pillow sandwich, sandwich squishes and being wrapped up or playing sushi rolls, whatever. But the challenge with that is that you can see it in the clinic over and over again. Some kids are like, do this again, do it again, do it again. I just can't get enough of it. And then you've got other kids who, if you put pressure on them, they can actually feel quite trapped and alarm them even more and put them into an even more defensive or high arousal state. So I think that's such an important piece that you shared, that it really does need to be individualized, because it can actually even be harmful for some of these kiddos.
Well, and the deep pressure is a really good example, because some kids are like, they'll love being wrapped up in Lycra. But if you try a fuzzy blanket, it's just going to freak them out, because the texture of the blanket is going to be one of those textures that's going to throw them into alarm. Or it could be the opposite, is that being squished by pillows is great, but burritoing in a piece of Lycra feels confining and trapped. And again, that throws into defense. So you're exactly right, as examples. And that's where the TheraPressure program and the brush was kind of designed to be in that middle ground, where you can use deep pressure in a nice, safe way, and a simple, intense way that allows that most people are able to benefit from. So instead of going, oh well, which brush, or which pillow, which ball, which thing, it's try to standardize at least one part of an approach.
I think too, with TheraPressure, because you are typically face to face or within a really proximal space to the child, you haven't got pillows covering their affect. You can really monitor their response. If you get that softening, if you get, I think you can see how that would impact a child really quickly. I say kids because I work with kids, but I'm assuming people.
Yeah.
Really, if this is comfortable or if this is actually not. And I agree with you. I think when the pressure's right, and which I know you go into in the course on how important the actual pressure is of the brushing, I think it is pretty hard to go wrong compared to when you add in these other elements of texture of a cushion or whatever it might be. So I have loved hearing all of this today. It's just taken me right back, and really reinforcement, like I said, when I listened to yours and Dave's Unplugged on Instagram, and then hearing you share today, it's so relevant still. Like I said, I actually did your course. I'm sure it was 2007, maybe 2008, around that time. And I was really new in the pediatric world. And at that time, I just was like, everyone needs to know this. This is a couple of decades ago nearly. And now it's carried me through. I use the information, I use the protocol, and it's still so relevant, if not more relevant in this day. And I'm so excited that you're coming out and sharing this. If anyone is on the fence about whether they should join the training with you guys, what would you say?
Well, the information is really, is dense, particularly the neuro, and really trying to think through the clinical reasoning and thinking through really how can you artfully design a sensory diet. And then the really hard thing about trying to figure out this course is the training. Very few people who haven't had direct training, and many people who've had training a long time ago, are no longer applying the technique correctly. In a recent course that I was at, historically, it's been about 25% of people who say they know how to do it can actually do it and are using the technique correctly. Only about 10% of people who've been trained by somebody other than inside of a course are. It looks really simple, but getting that pressure right, getting your confidence and your approach right is really hard, because you really have to have a good connection with the client, or you have to have this really good connection with the parents, so that the parents trust you to trust themselves. And that's not a super simple thing to learn. You cannot learn it from a video. And I have yet to see a single video online that's correct. And I gave up about a decade ago trying to take them all down, because it would have been a full-time job. And so I can just say there is not a single correct video online. And so the only way at this point, and I've tried to make videos, and I haven't even been able to get one that somebody translates, okay, here, everything is correct in the video. Now just watch the video and do this. And that doesn't translate. It just simply doesn't translate.
So for anyone watching, the moral is do the training and don't go onto YouTube and do a shortcut. There is no shortcut. And I think I really value that as well, because not only are we taking the brushing into our own practice, when we're talking about the intensity of the brushing across the day, we're required to train a teacher or an educator or a parent to do it well as well. So the harm, it kind of just carries on if we're not really getting it right from the start. So yeah, it's really important. And if I haven't said it already 50 times, it's just the knowledge of just the theory and the neuro itself, just it changes the whole way you would look at an individual anyway. Put aside the practical part and the sensory diet part. So thank you again. And if anyone wants to join the course with Patricia, with Julia and Dave, it's in a few weeks, I think, just under 4 weeks. I think David said 4 weeks ago, maybe a few days ago. And that's in Sydney. Is it Crow's Nest you guys are doing that at? Is that in Sydney?
That sounds familiar. I think you could go to Move About website and find whatever information.
So Move About Therapy Services, they do have a few clinics, but I feel like he did say the Crow's Nest in Sydney was where you guys were doing it. But jump on to Move About. Is there anywhere else people can be finding out more? I think, I don't know if Dave's Unplugged with you is still live, but if you're interested in hearing that, I'm sure I think he shared it on LinkedIn maybe. So yeah, it's, anything you can add to that on how to get involved?
Not right now. In the process of, things shut down completely during COVID pandemic, and then really just in the process of getting the course back up and running, and finding just the right partners like Move About, and really like literally across the world to start having more regional resources. I obviously can't keep running around the world indefinitely. So in the phase of really opening this up to get more trainers and more sites that can be trainers. So
yeah, it makes sense, because the theory is manageable online, but like you say, you can't teach the pressure that's required online. So it'd be great. I did hear Dave talking about having some trainers in different sites, which inspires me to I'll see Dave in a couple of months for a collaboration we're doing, or something we're doing, and he's supporting, and I'm actually going to get him to just check what I'm doing and make sure I'm still doing it okay. But yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you again for coming on and sharing. I know you're super busy, and you've got a lot to plan in just a few short weeks to come out here. So I really appreciate that. And for anyone listening or knows anyone who's an OT, I really hope you get onto this training. It was a really big one for me very early on, that definitely impacted the trajectory of where my career went and where my learning went. And I was at a very vulnerable piece in my career at that point, in terms of where I could have gone, and I had no knowledge and I was very unsupported. So to have stumbled across Jen, and then to stumble across yourselves, I just feel so grateful to that. So thank you again.
Well, thank you.
Take care.
Take care. Bye.